So we were, as the slide said, a national collaborative research project. We had about 100 researchers who got together to create the agenda and then to work on these 36 research studies that came together as Getting Down to Facts 2. From those 36 studies, we tried to combine them into 19 research briefs, which summarizes the results. And we broke it down into 4 areas as we were going through this: one on student success, another on governance, another on finance, and the final on personnel. And this is really the same format that we used in 2007, 10 years ago, when we did the first Getting Down to Facts, when the system was really quite different than it is now. I think the thought was going into this is that the last 10 years have seen a lot of big changes in California. We're about to hit a new administration, and this is a really good time to get a sense of what the facts are, to get a sense of where we are, what the big issues are, what some of the progress is that we've made, so that as we move into the new administration, when we start to debate about what the policies should be, we're at least on board, have the same kind of base of facts to work from. So that was the goal and where we were. So what are our findings? On the very broad level, I think we've seen that there have the state has made progress over the last 10 years, that we've put in new standards and assessments, and we'll talk about the fact that we've seen kind of overall support for those kinds of changes, overall support for a rationalization of the school finance system. We see achievement going in generally the right direction, but perhaps not fast enough. But so we've had some successes, and but there remains 2 areas. Two big things. One is that even where we've had successes, we need more work in order to make good use of them. And the second is that there have been areas that we haven't addressed that really need to address. And so the findings specifically focus on, as the little checks say here, that we need to build on the current reforms so that they can actually be useful in practice, increase funding and fix some of the finance system problems that haven't been addressed with local control funding formula. And then, even though we've made some progress in those areas, the size of the achievement gaps in California are really, unacceptably large, and we clearly need a greater push at addressing. So in those 3 areas, when we think of current reforms, I mentioned this briefly, but the local control funding formula took a really irrational system of funding where districts that looked very similar would get very different amounts, and where we really didn't provide additional dollars for districts that had higher costs or higher needs students. So there's been progress in terms of the funding formula, rationalizing it, and there's general support. So we tried to come at this from a lot of different ways. So we have some kind of causal, quantitative studies. We talked to 100 randomly selected superintendents, 50 randomly selected chief business officers. We had surveys of teachers and principals, and then we drew on a bunch of more qualitative observational data that had been collected in California. And so from a lot of different perspectives, there's support for the funding formula. That said, even though some districts are doing a really terrific job of using their resources, many districts don't have the capacity to use those resources well. And California has begun to create a system, but it nowhere near meets the needs of the districts in this use of resources. There is always a worry when you decentralize that it's not going to be good for the students in the district who have less power, whose families have less power in the district. And so there's a big equity concern with local control funding the local control funding formula. That said, we didn't see a lot of evidence of that at this point, that's a concern, and the quantitative study that we did, the causal study showed positive effects of these funding changes. But again, this is just the initial part, and we need more capacity in there to really make use of it. It was a similar story with the new academic standards. There's wide support for the new academic standards. You see teachers saying that their professional development is more aligned with standards than it was in the past, and higher quality than it was in the past. That said, again, there are lots of places in the state that need substantial capacity building to really make use of those standards to provide better educational opportunities for students. The third area that had kind of a similar, we've had some progress, but we really need more effort, is on information systems. If we have a decentralized system of education where each place is supposed to be making use of their knowledge and their effort in order to improve education, there really needs to be an information system that lets us as a state know how each area is doing, but also provides information locally so that places know what is available to them and what the effects are of the things that they've been doing. And currently, while California made progress, we used to not be able to know if the kids in California were learning. We couldn't follow them over time. Now we can follow them over time, but many of the links aren't there. So we don't know what services they're receiving. We can't see early childhood education or link them to their long run outcomes in higher education. And access to this data is really restricted. And so we've got the basis again, but need additional support. So this first one is build on current reforms. The second one is, it's pretty clear that California has relatively low resources in schools. We are about a mid-funding state. We're, higher than Florida, a little higher than Texas, substantially lower than many of the states in the Northeast. But we have a high cost of living, and as a result, our salaries are pretty high. And because our salaries are high, we have fewer adults in schools, fewer teachers, fewer administrators, less health services and mental health services than other states do. And so there's a clear fewer resources in California than other places. Moreover, we did an adequacy study to use professional judgment to get a sense of whether we needed additional resources. And their estimate is that we do need substantially more resources in schools than we have now. So the first is that just the funding levels are generally low in California. But, and this is true even though we had a real dip during the recession, and now we're kind of back to pre-recession levels, but we've never been at a point where we're spending the way that some other states are spending. But the local control funding formula did do this rationalization, but it didn't hit some key areas. And as many of you probably know, one of them is pension debt. For many years, we haven't been actually paying for the cost of pensions for current teachers. And as a result, we are now paying for the retirement of teachers who used to be in the system, as well as the cost of current teachers and their future retirement. And those additional costs are really substantial. In a few years, there'll be about a third of the cost of current teachers. And so this is a really big draw on our operating expenditures, and essentially some kind of reform will be needed on pensions unless we're willing to kind of continually spend a really substantial portion of operating expenditures on that. So pensions is one area that hasn't been dealt with. Special education finance is another. Special education finance wasn't part of LCFF, and it's unpredictable particularly for small districts, and also can be a lot of money. And as a result, it's one of the main things that district leaders point to as issues that they're struggling with, is special education funding. Facilities funding is also problematic in terms of the state funding tends to go more towards wealthy districts because it's on a first come, first serve basis. And if districts have an easier time raising funds locally, then they can get more state funds, which not surprisingly leads to inequalities. I don't think of those as at the same level as pensions and special education, but nonetheless, it's an issue in the funding structure that's worth thinking about. And then finally, there's just a big issue of achievement gaps. So California has greater achievement gaps by race, ethnicity, and income than other states do, and they are just big in general. So while students in affluent districts in California achieve at about the same level, so their test scores at about the same level of students in affluent districts across the nation, those in the lower income districts are really quite a bit below similar students in other states. So we've got these greater gaps. This is in a situation where we've actually closed gaps somewhat and increased achievement somewhat. So there have been some signs, but these trends have been slow relative to the big gaps that we had. Part of those gaps are likely due to inequalities in the education system itself, and we're going to talk about a bunch of those today. So if you look at teachers and educators in general, they appear to be unequally distributed across the state. If you look at English learners, they're not getting access to some of the core content that other students are. So there are concerns with inequalities in the K-12 system. That said, there are substantial gaps that are evident when kids enter kindergarten, which stem at least in part from California's lack of focus on early childhood education. While other states have been much more strategic in creating an early childhood education system where the educational institutions have incentives to be better, where there are regulations, where there's funding and spots for children, particularly children whose families can't afford to send them to private centers. California hasn't made the investments in that area, and we see that in the large gaps that are evident at kindergarten entry.